If someone had told me a year ago that I'd find the single most disruptive and essential person in my life at the bottom of the world, I would have laughed. I didn't come to the Antarctic for people. I came for the silence. I came for the clean, sterile emptiness of it all, a landscape that matched the one I had so carefully cultivated inside myself. My life was a series of control variables. I was a climatologist. I measured atmospheric pressure, particulate matter, the slow, inexorable creep of temperature change. My world was data, predictable patterns, the comfort of a number that could be verified. I lived in a universe of charts and graphs, a place where emotion was a messy, unnecessary outlier to be discarded from the final analysis. The research station, a collection of modular buildings bolted to the ice shelf, was my sanctuary. A tiny, fragile bubble of warmth and routine against an infinite expanse of cold. Here, my solitude was not just accepted, it was the default setting. We were a skeleton crew of scientists and support staff, each of us isolated in our own specific function. My function was to observe, and I observed everything. The way the light fractured across the ice at dawn, turning the world into a diamond. The subtle shift in the wind's howl that signaled a coming storm. The weary slump in Dr. Eris's shoulders after a long shift. And him, Caleb, from the triple-pane window of my lab, I had a perfect view of the workshop and the staging area. My observation of Caleb began as a data point. He was the station's lead mechanic, the man who kept the fragile life support systems of our world from collapsing. He was a physical fact, big, broad-shouldered, with a frame built for leverage and force. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute competence. He never wasted a step, never made a superfluous gesture. He was the antithesis of me. Where I was all quiet calculation and internal thought, Caleb was external force and decisive action. I watched him in the brutal, 24-hour sunlight of summer, his face grim beneath his goggles as he wrestled with a broken snowcat engine. I saw the raw, physical power in the way he could lift a fuel drum that two other people would struggle with. His voice, when I heard it, was a low rumble, often sharp and impatient, cutting through the wind with orders. To me, he seemed like a creature carved from the ice itself. Hard, cold, and dangerously beautiful. I perceived his confidence as arrogance, his curtness as disdain. He was the king of the physical world, the realm of grease and steel and roaring engines. I was a ghost in the machine, a man who dealt in the abstract, and I was convinced he saw me as little more than useless, intellectual dead weight. Our interactions were minimal and always transactional. A generator for my atmospheric sensors would fail. I would file a report. Hours later, Caleb would appear at my lab door, a shadow filling the frame. He never knocked, so much as materialized. Generators out, he would state. It was not a question. Yes, the data feed is down. My voice always sounded thin, reedy, next to his. He would grunt, a sound of profound annoyance, and brush past me without another word. I would retreat to my chair, feeling like a child who had broken a toy, and watch as he worked. His hands were large and calloused, yet they moved with a surgeon's precision among the delicate wires and circuits. He never spoke. The only sounds were the clink of his tools and the low hum of the station around us. When he was finished, he would pack his things, grunt again, and leave. The air in the lab would feel empty, and my own solitude, usually a comfortable blanket, would suddenly feel like a cage. This was the distance between us. Not just the few hundred feet separating my lab from his workshop, but a vast, unbridgeable chasm of temperament and purpose. He was the body of the station, and I was one of its many disembodied minds. I cataloged my observations of him like any other data set. The way he squinted against the glare, the dark stubble that always shadowed his jaw, the deep lines of concentration etched between his brows. It was a sterile, scientific curiosity, or so I told myself. But science could not explain the frantic, trapped bird flutter of my heart when he would unexpectedly look up and our eyes would meet across the compound. It couldn't explain the heat that would bloom in my chest, a strange, unwelcome warmth in the perpetual cold. It was an anomaly, a variable I couldn't control. And like any good scientist, I tried my best to ignore it. My routine was my defense. Wake, calibrate the instruments, analyze the previous day's data, eat alone, read, sleep. A perfect closed loop. A life insulated from the unpredictable chaos of human connection. I had built these walls high and thick over many years, and they had served me well. Then the storm came, and it blew them all down. It wasn't supposed to be a big one. The forecast had called for moderate winds, some snow. A typical Tuesday at the edge of the world. But the models were wrong. The pressure dropped with an unnerving speed. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. A physical, malevolent presence that shook the station to its steel bones. We were sealed in. All external activity ceased. For 48 hours, the world outside was a roaring, white void. And then, a new kind of silence descended. An electronic one. My primary sensor array, located a quarter-mile from the main station in a small, heated outbuilding, went dark. The data feed flatlined. At the same time, the main communications antenna, battered by ice and wind, failed. We were cut off, blind and deaf. A meeting was called in the mess hall. The air was thick with tension. Caleb stood before us, his face a mask of grim control. "The comms antenna is secondary," he announced, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "The priority is the long-range sensor array, Leo's equipment. It's our only early warning for weather shifts of this magnitude. We can't afford to be blind." He looked at me, and for the first time, his gaze held. It wasn't dismissive. It was assessing. "The outbuilding's main generator is reporting a fault. I have to go out there. But the backup is old. Temperamental. I need someone monitoring it constantly while I work. Someone who knows what the readings should be." The implication hung in the air. He needed me. The world shrank to the small cabin of the snowcat, the roar of its engine a pathetic defiance against the storm's lingering fury. Caleb drove, his hands sure on the controls, his eyes scanning the maelstrom of white beyond the windshield. I sat beside him, my own hands clenched into fists in my lap. The proximity was unnerving. He was a physical presence that seemed to consume all the available oxygen. I could smell the faint scent of engine oil and coffee on him. I could see the tension in the hard line of his jaw. We were forced together, not by choice, but by necessity. My carefully constructed routine was shattered. The comfortable distance I had maintained was now just a few inches of cold air. The outbuilding was a small, metal box fighting a losing battle against the cold. Inside, the air was frigid. The main generator was silent, a hulking piece of dead metal. The only light came from the frantic flickering of the emergency strobes, and the only sound was the sputtering, uneven chug of the backup generator in the adjoining shed. "Stay with it," Caleb ordered, his voice tight. He pointed to the backup unit. "Don't let the voltage drop below 200. If it does, we lose the heaters for the sensor housing, and the lenses will crack." "It's all over." He didn't wait for a reply. He was already pulling on his heavy work gloves, his focus entirely on the dead engine before him. I was dismissed, a glorified switch flipper. I retreated to the small, connecting shed where the backup generator rattled and groaned. And so my new observation began. It was different here, not from a sterile distance of my lab window, but up close, inches away. The generator shed was barely big enough for the machine and one person. I sat on an overturned crate, my back to the thin metal wall, and watched him through the open doorway. The emergency strobes cast the main room in a frantic, pulsating light, catching the sharp angles of his face, then plunging them into shadow. For the first time, I saw the weariness in him. It was profound. It wasn't just physical tiredness. It was a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. The weight of keeping us all alive was etched into the lines around his eyes. They were deeper than I'd realized. I noticed a scar, a thin, white line that bisected his left eyebrow. It was a detail I'd never seen from afar. I wonder how he got it. A slip of a wrench? A piece of flying ice? It was a mark of imperfection on a man who seemed anything but. It made him real. He worked with a furious, focused intensity, but I could see the frustration building. A bolt was frozen solid. He threw his entire weight against the wrench, his muscles cording in his arms and back, a low grunt of effort torn from his throat. The bolt wouldn't budge. He swore, a sharp, violent curse that was swallowed by the noise of the storm. He slammed the wrench down on the workbench. The clang echoed in the small space. He stood there for a long moment, his head bowed, his hands braced on the bench. His shoulders rose and fell with his heavy breaths. In that moment, he wasn't the station's unshakable commander. He was just a man, pushed to his limit, alone against a machine that refused to yield. A wave of something I couldn't name washed over me. It wasn't pity. It was empathy, a sudden, shocking recognition of his humanity. He must have felt my eyes on him. He straightened up, turned his head, and looked directly at me. His expression was raw, unguarded, a flash of anger, of frustration, of something that looked startlingly like desperation. My first instinct was to look away, to retreat back into my invisibility. But I held his gaze. For a heartbeat, maybe two, the roles were reversed. He was the one exposed. Then the mask slammed back down. He turned away, picked up a smaller tool, and went back to work. But the image of his face, stripped of its usual confidence, was burned into my mind. An hour passed, then two. The tiny shed grew colder. I was shivering despite my layers. Caleb worked without pause, his movements becoming slower, more deliberate, as fatigue set in. He was trying to rethread a series of wires into a complex panel, his large fingers clumsy in the confined space. His gloves were off now, his hands exposed to the biting air. I could see them shaking, just slightly, a fine tremor born of cold and exhaustion. He was holding a tiny screw with a pair of tweezers. As he tried to guide it into place, his hand jerked. The screw slipped, a tiny glint of metal falling through the air. I didn't think. I reacted. I lunged forward from my crate, my own numb hand outstretched. My fingers closed around the small, cold piece of metal just before it hit the grated floor and vanished forever. I knelt there on the freezing concrete, the screw safe in my palm. Caleb was frozen, his hands still hovering in the air. He stared down at me. I looked up and then at my hand, opening my fingers to show him the screw. "Here," I said. My voice was a croak. He reached down to take it. As his fingers brushed against my palm, a jolt went through me. A pure, undiluted shock of heat and electricity. It was like grabbing a live wire. My breath hitched. His skin was rough, calloused, but there was a current of warmth in it that seemed impossible in this cold. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second too long. His eyes were locked on mine. The world seemed to stop. The roar of the storm, the rattle of the generator. It all faded into a dull, distant hum. There was only the feeling of his skin against mine, the sudden, terrifying intimacy of the touch. My heart was a hammer against my ribs. He feels it too. The thought was immediate, instinctive, and utterly insane. Then he pulled his hand back as if burned. He took the screw, his gaze dropping. "Thanks," he grunted. The word was rough, forced. He turned back to the panel, his back ramrod straight. But something had irrevocably broken. A seal. A barrier. The air between us was no longer empty. It was charged, thick with the unspoken. I retreated to my crate, my hand tingling, my entire body humming with a strange, new frequency. I had touched him, and the world had not ended. In fact, it felt as though it had just begun. Just then, the backup generator gave a loud cough, sputtered, and the rhythmic chugging devolved into a sickly, uneven limp. The lights in the main room dimmed, then flickered violently. Caleb spun around, his face tight with alarm. "What was that? What's the voltage?" I scrambled to check the gauge. "It's dropping. It's at 190, damn it," he snarled, abandoning the main generator and striding into the small shed. The space, already cramped with just me, became impossibly small with him in it. He loomed over the machine, his presence a wall of heat and frustration. What is wrong with this piece of junk? He started checking the fuel lines, his movements now jerky and angry. He was out his depth. This wasn't a powerful, modern engine. It was an antique, a relic, and he was trying to fix it with brute force. And then the strangest thing happened. A memory surfaced. From a post I'd had years ago, in a remote observatory in the Andes. They had the same model of generator, a cantankerous old beast that required finesse, not force. My voice was quiet, hesitant. It might be the intake valve. Caleb didn't even look at me. The intake is fine. I checked it. No, not the main one. I persisted, a strange boldness rising in me. There's a secondary regulator. It gets clogged with ice crystals if the fuel temperature drops too fast. You can't force it. You have to warm it. He stopped. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. Warm it? With what, a campfire? With your hands? I said, my confidence growing. I stood up and pointed to a small, unassuming brass fitting half hidden behind a tangle of hoses. There, you have to hold it for a few minutes. Your body heat will be enough to melt the crystals inside. He stared at the fitting, then back at me. I could see the war in his eyes. His pride, his expertise, against the quiet, theoretical knowledge of the scientist he probably thought of as useless. The generator coughed again, more violently this time. The lights flickered and died, plunging us into the dim, red glow of a single emergency bulb. That decided it. Without a word, he pulled off his gloves again, reached deep into the machine's guts, and wrapped his large hands around the small brass fitting. He leaned against the generator, his eyes closed, his jaw tight with concentration. I stood beside him, our shoulders almost touching. The power dynamic had completely inverted. Here, in this small, cold shed, I was the expert. He was the one following my instructions. His competence, which had always seemed like a weapon used to diminish me, was gone. In its place was a quiet, grudging reliance. He needed me, and my knowledge. We stood like that in the red gloom for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds were the dying gasps of the generator and the scream of the wind. I was acutely aware of his closeness, of the heat radiating from his body. I could see the pulse beating in the thick column of his neck. Okay, I whispered. Try it now. He opened his eyes. He gave a sharp nod, then hit the ignition switch. The generator sputtered, caught, and then roared back to life with a steady, powerful rhythm. The main lights flickered on, bright and unwavering. Caleb slumped against the machine, a long, shuddering breath escaping him. He looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The annoyance was gone. In its place was something else. A flicker of respect, maybe even wonder. How did you know that? He asked, his voice low. I read the manual, I said. A small, dry joke. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines. Right, the manual. The main generator would take hours more to fix. The storm showed no signs of letting up. We were trapped together in this small bubble of light and warmth we had just saved. The barrier between us, once a glacier, was now just a thin sheet of ice, cracking under the weight of a shared crisis and a single, accidental touch. And I had no idea what would happen when it finally broke. Night fell, or rather, the relentless gray twilight of a polar winter deepened into a slightly darker gray. The storm hadn't abated. It was a constant, living thing, a beast clawing at the thin metal walls of our shelter. Caleb had finally finished with the main generator. It now hummed with a steady, reassuring power, but he said it was too risky to try and make it back to the main station until the wind died down. So we were stranded. The outbuilding was essentially one large workshop with a tiny, windowless room at the back that held a single cot, a small desk, and a rations locker. It was a space designed for one person to wait out a storm, not two. The intimacy of it was a physical pressure on my chest. Caleb broke open 2 ration packs in silence. We ate, sitting on opposite sides of the workshop, the humming generator the only sound between us. The charged atmosphere of the generator shed had followed us back in. Every time I risked a glance at him, he seemed to be staring at the wall, lost in his own thoughts. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was a wire stretch taut. When we finished, he took the empty packets and disposed of them. He walked over to the small room, then paused in the doorway. You take the cot, he said, his back to me. I'll be fine out here. No, you should, I said, my voice too quick. You did all the work. You need to rest. He turned his head slightly. It's not a suggestion. Leo, he used my name. It was the first time he'd ever used my name without a hint of annoyance. It sounded strange in his mouth. Solid. Real. I retreated to the small room, the unspoken tension following me like a shadow. I sat on the edge of the narrow cot, listening to the sounds of him moving around in the workshop, the clink of a tool being put away, the zip of his outer parka being hung up. Then silence. Just the hum of the machines and the howl of the wind. The room was small, claustrophobic. The air was cold and smelled of oil and metal. I couldn't sleep. My mind was a chaotic mess, replaying the moment our hands touched, the look in his eyes when the backup generator roared to life. These were new data points, and I had no framework to process them. Hours must have passed. I lay on the cot, fully clothed, staring into the darkness. I thought he was asleep, but then I heard his voice from the other room, low and rough. "You still awake?" My heart leaped into my throat. Yes, another long silence. I could hear him shift his weight. A floorboard creaked. "I hate the storms," he said. The confession was so quiet I almost missed it. It seemed pulled from him, a reluctant admission. "They're loud?" I offered lamely. "It's not the noise," he said. "It's the quiet after. When the wind stops. The silence. It's too big. Remind me how empty this place is," he paused. "How empty I am." The vulnerability in his voice was a physical shock. This was not the Caleb I knew, the commander of engines and men. This was someone else entirely. Someone who felt the crushing weight of this magnificent, terrible isolation just as I did. Maybe even more so. And his honesty, his unexpected crack in the armor, created a fissure in my own. The words were in my throat before I could stop them. They felt like rocks, jagged and heavy. "I feel more alone in a crowded room than I do here," I said, the words a faint whisper in the dark. "Here, the solitude feels honest. Back home, it was just pathetic." I heard him move. He appeared in the doorway, a large, dark silhouette against the faint light from the workshop. He didn't come in. He just stood there, leaning against the frame. "You're always watching," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "From your window. I see you." A hot flush of shame and panic washed over me. I had been discovered. My secret, sterile observations laid bare. I was just the snowcats." "It's not the snowcats," he said, his voice soft. "It's me." The wire of tension between us snapped. There was nothing left but the raw, terrifying truth. My carefully constructed walls of scientific detachment crumbled into dust. "Yes," I breathed. The admission hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. "It's you." My heart was a frantic, trapped bird, beating against the cage of my ribs. This is it. This is the moment he scoffs, calls me a freak, and walks away, leaving me to freeze in the mortifying silence. "Why?" he asked. Just that one word, but held everything. And I couldn't lie. I was too tired, too raw, too overwhelmed by the events of the day. The truth, which I had kept locked away in the deepest part of myself, simply spilled out. "Because you're everything I'm not," I said, my voice shaking. "You're so present. You fix things. You make things work. You're solid. I'm just data. I'm just thoughts." And I look at you, and I trailed off, unable to say the words. "You what?" he prompted, his voice still quiet, but with a new intensity. I took a breath. It felt like plunging into icy water. "I think I've been half in love with you since the day I got here." The silence that followed was absolute. It was bigger than the storm. It was bigger than the entire continent. It was a vacuum that sucked all the air from my lungs. I had done it. I had taken the most volatile, unpredictable variable and thrown it into the middle of my perfectly controlled experiment. I had ruined everything. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the impact, but it didn't come. Instead, I heard a move, a soft footstep on the floor, then another. He was coming into the room. He was coming towards me. I opened my eyes. He was standing over the cot, so close I could feel the heat of him. His face was in shadow, his expression unreadable. My body went rigid with fear and anticipation. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if not to startle a wild animal. He knelt down beside the cot. We were eye level now. He lifted a hand, the same hand that had brushed mine earlier, and gently, so gently, cupped my jaw, His thumb was rough against my skin. It traced the line of my cheekbone, sending a cascade of fire through my veins. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, his eyes searching my face in the dim light. And in their depths I saw it. Not disgust, not anger, but the same desperate, hungry loneliness I saw in the mirror every morning. A mirror of my own longing. He leaned in. The kiss was not what I would have expected. It wasn't hard or demanding or passionate. It was hesitant, questioning. His lips were chapped from the cold, and they barely brushed against mine at first, a soft, tentative exploration. It was a question asked without words. "Are you sure? Is this real?" I answered by leaning into it, my hands coming up to rest on his broad shoulders. He felt so solid, so real beneath my touch. The kiss deepened then, a slow, mutual surrender. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was the quiet after the storm. It was the end of a solitude I hadn't even realized I was dying from. It was the most honest thing I had ever done. The world outside was a maelstrom of ice and wind. But in that small, cold room, for the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly safe. Dawn broke with an almost violent silence. The storm had passed. The wind was gone. The world outside the small porthole of the outbuilding was a pristine, achingly beautiful landscape of white and blue. The silence Caleb had dreaded was here. I woke up alone. The cot was cold beside me. For a disoriented moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. The confession, the kiss. But the imprint of his body was still a faint warmth in the mattress, and the air still held the scent of him. I sat up, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I could hear him in the workshop, the brisk, efficient sounds of him packing his tools. I pulled on my boots and walked out. He was already in his full outdoor gear, his back to me. He was checking the newly repaired comms link. "Comms are back online," he said, without turning around. His voice was different. It was the voice from before. Curt, professional, all business. The soft, vulnerable man from the darkness was gone. "Main station is reporting clear skies. We can head back," my stomach filled with bees. A frantic, buzzing anxiety. He regrets it. The thought screamed through my mind. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness brought on by fear and isolation. A fluke in the data. "Okay," I managed to say. My own voice sounded hollow. He still didn't look at me. He just grabbed his gear bag and headed for the door. "Let's go." The journey back in the snowcat was a nightmare of unspoken words. The silence was a physical entity, a third passenger in the small cabin. It pressed in on me, suffocating me. I sat rigid, staring out at the endless white, replaying every second of the night before. My own foolish, desperate words. His hesitant response. Had I forced him? Had I misread everything? The shame was a hot, bitter acid in my throat. Back at the main station, it was even worse. Life snapped back to its familiar rhythm, but my place in it felt alien. Caleb didn't just avoid me. He acted as if I didn't exist. We passed in the narrow hallway outside the mess hall. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but his eyes, the same eyes that had looked at me with such raw honesty just hours before, slid right over me as if I were a piece of furniture. He walked past without a flicker of recognition. The blow was so physical I actually flinched. The chasm between us, which had been so briefly and miraculously bridged, was now wider and deeper than ever before. It was filled with the wreckage of my own foolish hope. My solitude, once my trusted shield, returned. But it was different now. It was no longer a comfort. It was a punishment. My lab felt like a prison cell. The silence I had once craved was now filled with the ghost of his voice, the memory of his touch. My carefully ordered world of data and patterns was a chaotic ruin. I couldn't focus. The numbers on my screen were just meaningless squiggles. Every chart, every graph, seemed to mock me with its cold, emotionless logic. I had become the outlier, the messy, human data point that had to be discarded. A day passed, then two. Each hour was a new kind of torment. I ate my meals at odd times to avoid the mess hall. I kept my head down, my world shrinking to the path between my room and my lab. I saw him from my window, back in his own world, lifting and hauling and fixing the competent, unshakable man he had always been. It was as if the storm and everything that had happened within it had never occurred. I began to believe I had imagined it, that my own desperate loneliness had conjured the whole thing. A waking dream, a hallucination born of cold and fear. It was the only explanation that made any sense, because the alternative, that it was real and he had rejected it so completely, was too painful to bear. I resolved to put it behind me, to rebuild my walls, to retreat back into the safety of my numbers. I would be a scientist. I would observe. I would not feel. It was a cold, grim promise to myself. I was sitting in my lab late on the third night, staring blankly at a screen of atmospheric data when a knock came at the door. Not the perfunctory rap of a colleague, but a heavy, hesitant sound. My heart stopped. I knew who it was before I even turned around. He stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the brightly lit hallway. He wasn't in his work gear, just a plain gray thermal shirt and cargo pants. He looked diminished. The towering confidence was gone. He looked exhausted, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked utterly, completely lost. He just stood there for a long time, his hand still on the doorframe, as if he didn't have the strength to come in or the will to leave. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. Finally, I found my voice. It was brittle. Did something break again? The question was meant to be sarcastic, a pathetic attempt to armor myself. But it just came out sounding wounded. He seemed to flinch. He shook his head slowly. Yes, he said, his voice so low I could barely hear it. Me. He stepped into the lab and let the door swing shut behind him, sealing us in. The click of the latch was deafening. He didn't move any closer. He just stood by the door, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were gravelly, forced. "Now, I'm sorry, I didn't say anything. I couldn't." A storm of hope and fear and anger was raging inside me, and I didn't trust myself to speak. "I panicked," he went on, finally looking up at me. His eyes were shadowed, filled with a turmoil that mirrored my own. "Back there, in the outbuilding. And then when we got back here, I panicked. You have a funny way of panicking," I said, the bitterness leaking through despite myself. "It looked a lot like you were pretending I didn't exist." "I know," he said, taking a step closer. "I know how it looked. I'm not good at this." He gestured vaguely between us. "Feelings. People. I'm good with engines. I can take a generator apart and put it back together blindfolded. If something's broken, I know how to fix it. But this," his voice trailed off. He looked helpless. "I've never felt that before," he said, his gaze intense. "What I felt with you. And it terrified me. My first instinct, my only instinct, was to run, to put it back in a box and pretend it never happened. I thought if I just ignored it, if I went back to how things were, it would all go away." He took another step. "We were only a few feet apart now. But it didn't. The silence these last few days, it's been worse than any storm. It's been louder." My own armor began to crack. The anger, the hurt, began to recede, replaced by a painful, burgeoning empathy. He wasn't cold. He wasn't cruel. He was just scared, as scared as I was. I thought I imagined it. I confessed, my voice barely a whisper, or that I'd made you do something you didn't want to. That I'd misread everything. "You didn't misread anything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You read it perfectly. That's what scared me." He closed the remaining distance between us. He stood before me, so close I could see the flecks of gray in his dark eyes. He looked down at me, his expression a raw mix of regret and hope. "I'm not good with words, Leo," he said. "I never have been." He slowly raised his hand. It was trembling slightly, not from cold this time. He held it out, palm up. Lying in the center of his calloused, grease-stained hand was a small object. It was a piece of soapstone carved and polished into the shape of a tiny, perfect penguin. The detail was incredible. The stone was smooth, cool, and gray, with delicate lines etched into it to simulate feathers. I stared at it, speechless. "I make them sometimes," he said, his gaze fixed on the small carving. "During the long nights. Helps me think. I made this one for you. Weeks ago. I was going to leave it on your desk or something. I never worked up the nerve." he was offering me a piece of himself. Not a grand declaration, but something small and solid and real. Something he had made with his own hands during his own lonely hours. It was a confession more eloquent than any words could ever be. I reached out and gently took the penguin from his palm. My fingers brushed against his, and this time, neither of us pulled away. The spark was still there, a quiet, steady current. The stone was heavy in my hand, a tangible promise. I looked up at him, and the last of my fear melted away. "It's beautiful," I said. "I don't know what we're doing," he said, his voice raw with vulnerability. "This is new territory. I'm probably going to screw it up, me too," I admitted, a small, watery smile touching my lips. "We can probably screw it up together." He let out a shaky breath that might have been a laugh. And then he reached out, his other hand coming up to gently cup my cheek, just as he had in the darkness of the outbuilding. "Okay," he whispered. Together, the old routine was gone. In its place, a new one began to form, quietly and organically, in the spaces between our work. It was a routine built not on solitude, but on small, shared moments. It started with coffee. A few days after our conversation, I was hunched over my desk, lost in a sea of data, when a mug of steaming black coffee appeared beside my hand. I looked up. Caleb was standing there, a mug of his own in his other hand. He didn't say anything. He just gave me a small, almost shy nod, and then leaned against the doorframe, sipping his coffee while I drank mine. He didn't ask about my work. I didn't ask about his. We just existed in the same space for 10 minutes, a comfortable silence replacing the agonizing one that had haunted us before. It became a daily ritual. Then I found myself migrating. I finished my analysis for the day, and instead of retreating to my sterile room, I'd wander over to the workshop. The first time, I felt like an intruder. But Caleb looked up from the engine he was working on, wiped his hands on a rag, and gestured with his chin to a stool in the corner. "Pull up a chair," he'd grunted. So I did. I would sit and watch him work, the smell of oil and hot metal filling my senses. He'd explain what he was doing in his low, rumbling voice, pointing out the elegant mechanics of a diesel engine, the logic of a hydraulic system. I was seeing his world through his eyes, a world of tangible, beautiful order. And he would ask me about mine, about the patterns in the jet stream, the story the ice cores told. He listened with a focused intensity that made me feel, for the first time, truly heard. The mess hall, once a place of anxiety, became our space. We would sit at a small table, our knees brushing underneath a secret current of electricity that was ours alone. The loud chatter of our colleagues faded into a distant buzz. Our world had shrunk to the space between us. One night, he walked me back to my room. At the door, we paused. The hallway was empty. He just looked at me for a long moment. Then he leaned down and pressed a soft, brief kiss to my lips. It was a simple, gentle gesture of affection, yet it felt more profound than anything that had happened in the storm. It was real life. It wasn't born of desperation or fear. It was a choice. Soon, he wasn't just walking me to my door. He was coming inside. My small, Spartan room, once just a place to sleep, began to feel like a home. We would lie on my narrow bunk, his large frame taking up most of the space, and talk for hours. He told me about his life back home, a life he felt he was running from. I told him about my own quiet, lonely existence. We were mapping the uncharted territories of each other's pasts. Now, my mornings are different. I wake up not to the silence of an empty room, but to the steady, reassuring weight of his arm slung over my waist. I watch the slow dawn break across the ice fields, but I'm no longer just observing a weather pattern. I'm watching the light catch the scar over his eyebrow, the way his dark lashes rest against his cheek. He is my new focal point, the center of my new universe. I came to the coldest, most isolated place on Earth to hide. I came here for the safety of predictable patterns, to shield myself from the messy, chaotic variable of human emotion. I built a fortress of solitude and called it peace. Caleb was the storm I never saw coming. He was the unforeseen event, the catastrophic disruption that shattered all my models. He smashed through my walls, broke all my equipment, and tore my carefully controlled world to pieces. He didn't just change my routine, He fundamentally altered the climate of my entire life. He was the plot twist I never knew my story needed. He disrupted everything, and in doing so, he saved me. He saved me from a life of sterile observation, from the crushing emptiness I had mistaken for safety. He taught me that the most beautiful patterns aren't the ones you find in the data, but the ones you build with someone else. A new routine of shared coffee, of quiet conversations, of waking up in the arms of the one person who makes the silence feel like home. Have you ever had a moment where you risked everything on a single, terrifying confession? Let me know your story in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about finding love in unexpected places, make sure to subscribe.